They called it a junkyard, said I was ruining the view, that my cattle farm built from 100 shipping containers didn't belong near their pristine suburban paradise. But when winter came, and their power lines froze, and their pipes burst, my cattle slept warm. My family stayed fed. They blocked roads, sabotaged my water lines, filed complaint after complaint trying to bury us in red tape. What they didn't know, I'm not just a rancher. I'm the man who designed shelters for disaster zones, and I had every bolt, every panel, every law on my side. They tried to shut us down, but they built their fight on fear. I built mine on steel. It began with steel, not timber, not brick steel. 100 weathered, scarred shipping containers salvaged from forgotten corners of the world, now rising across 4 acres of our Montana soil. Each one dented by ocean storms, faded by years under salt and sun, yet reborn in my hands as something unbreakable, something vital. I never set out to wage war against a homeowners association. I set out to build a fortress strong enough to shield our Black Angus herd and the family I loved from the cruelest winter this valley had seen in decades. People called me stubborn. Some whispered crazy. Maybe they were right. But when you have 2 boys who look to you for safety, a wife who has walked through fire at your side, and a herd that puts food on the table, and meaning in your days, you do whatever it takes. We had come home 2 years earlier. I walked away from a steady contracting job in Denver, good money, long hours, and a slow erosion of my soul. Engineering blueprints on a computer screen never filled my chest the way the high, thin air of these ridgelines did. Harper had grown up on this land running barefoot through these same pastures before her parents passed. When the city finally ground me down, she looked across the kitchen table one night and said the words that changed everything. "Let's go home." So we did. Me, Harper, 16-year-old Luke, and 12-year-old Jonah. We loaded what mattered into a stock trailer and drove north until the mountains rose like old friends on the horizon. The farmhouse was weathered but proud. The old barn collapsed inward like a tired animal, and the ground still iron hard, even in late April. Yet the moment we crossed the cattle guard, something in all of us exhaled. This was ours. The first year was pure reconstruction. I drew on every skill I'd earned, drafting precise plans, welding structural supports, calculating thermal bridges and airflow. The second year became expansion. That was when I first sketched the container concept on the back of an envelope over morning coffee. I'd spent time with FEMA years before designing emergency shelters that could stand against Category 4 hurricanes. I knew what those steel boxes were capable of. And with Montana winters growing longer and meaner, I needed something modular, weatherproof, and affordable, something that could laugh at 60-mile-an-hour gales and sub-zero nights. So I hunted them down one by one from salvage yards, auction lots, and rail yards across 3 states. Dented giants in faded blues, reds, and rust. By the 12th unit, Luke had learned to lay a clean bead with the welder. By the 32nd, Jonah could strip insulation panels faster than I could fire up the grinder. Harper didn't merely cheer from the sidelines. She stained reclaimed lumber for interior finishes, sealed foam gaps with steady hands, and taught the boys how to keep curious cattle away from a live torch. It became a family rhythm. Every window we cut, every door we framed, every ventilation duct we installed, we did together. Sweat laughter, the smell of hot metal and fresh sawdust. The boys grew taller beside those steel walls, and Harper's quiet pride shone brighter than any cutting flame. What emerged was more than shelter. It was a living grid, underground piping that circulated warmth between modules, passive-cooled, feed storage, wind-resistant anchoring that turned howling storms into distant whispers. I mapped optimal airflow, created separate calving zones with soft lighting and heated floors, installed graywater recycling from roof runoff. Each steel haven was numbered, labeled, and fine-tuned. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. We even built a small elevated platform along one side so school groups could visit safely and watch the herd move through their new home. Harper named it the Ark. The name stuck, something sturdy enough to carry life through the flood. By mid-October, as the high country began to dust with early snow, we were welding the final seams on Unit 98. The valley smelled of frost and pine. The cattle had already begun to settle into their new quarters, their breath rising in soft clouds inside the warm modules. I was up on a ladder sealing a roof vent when Harper's voice drifted up from below, calm, but edged with that particular steel she reserved for trouble. "Colt, you need to come down." I looked toward the gravel drive. A black SUV crawled up the lane like it had all the time in the world. Two men in pressed suits stepped out, one clutching a clipboard, the other wearing the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes. The clipboard man cleared his throat. "Mr. Ramsey, we represent the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association." I wiped flux from my gloves and climbed down slowly. "We're not in Oak Meadows. Your property is adjacent to our perimeter and clearly visible from multiple resident vantage points," he replied, as though reading from an invisible script. "We've received complaints." "About what exactly?" He gestured toward the grid of steel modules gleaming in the afternoon light. "That industrial installation. It's livestock housing," I said. "It's an eyesore," the second man cut in, smile gone. "They informed me politely, firmly, that our structures violated their visual uniformity standards and must be dismantled within 30 days. I reminded them, as calmly as I could, that our land had been zoned agricultural since the 1890s, and that no covenant signed by my family bound us to their aesthetic preferences. They left with clipped warnings and the faint smell of expensive cologne hanging in the cold air. That night, Harper cooked venison stew, while I sat with the boys at the old oak table, reviewing reinforcement drawings for the final 2 units. She didn't ask what I intended to do. She already knew. "I'll finish it," I said quietly, tracing a weld line on the blueprint. "No matter what letters they send." Luke looked up, eyes fierce. "They don't understand, Dad. This isn't just shelter. It's everything we've got." I met his gaze and nodded. "Then we'll make sure they never forget it." By the end of that week, all 100 steel modules stood bolted, sealed, and alive with purpose. The herd moved in fully. The heating grid hummed smoothly. Fresh calves slept warm through the first hard frosts. I added solar marker lights along the perimeter, part safety, part quiet defiance. From the Oak Meadows walking trail, our fortress caught the low sun and shimmered like a promise kept. We were ready, or so I believed, because what came next wasn't merely complaint. It was war. The first real shot across the bow arrived not with a knock, but slipped quietly into our mailbox like a venomous snake. It was a single sheet of paper folded into crisp thirds, tucked inside a plain white envelope bearing the embossed gold crest of the Oak Meadows Covenant Council. No certified mail, no return address beyond a generic P.O. box. Just the weight of entitlement pressed into expensive stationery. Harper spotted it first, wedged between a seed catalog and a power bill. She carried it into the kitchen without a word, the way you might carry something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Her fingers tightened around the edges as she read the fine lines around her eyes deepening. She slid it across the breakfast table to me. Steam curled from my untouched coffee, while the bold heading burned itself into my mind. Notice of structural non-compliance. The words beneath were colder than the frost already forming on the windows. Your property, situated adjacent to the Oak Meadows community, creates substantial visual disruption and aesthetic disharmony. Continued use of industrial shipping containers violates Section 8 of the Aesthetic Integration Covenant. Failure to dismantle and remove all non-compliant structures within 14 business days will result in legal escalation. At the bottom, no personal name. Just the sterile line, Oak Meadows HOA Board. No citation of actual law. No map of boundaries. No phone number to call. Just a threat dressed up as procedure. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling the old familiar heat rise in my chest. The same heat I used to feel on job sites when a bad inspection threatened an entire build. I never signed any covenant. I said more to the paper than to Harper. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. And this land was zoned agricultural 100 years before Oak Meadows ever poured its first perfect sidewalk. We both knew exactly who had orchestrated it: Karen Delaney, vice president of the HOA. She lived 3 houses down the eastern ridge, just far enough that her manicured lawn didn't quite touch ours, but close enough that our pastures had always been part of her borrowed view. She'd come by once the previous spring before a single steel module had arrived. All pearl earrings and practiced sympathy, asking if we planned anything that might affect community aesthetics. I'd told her straight we were raising cattle. She'd smiled like I'd confessed to storing hazardous waste. Now that smile had hardened into this letter. 2 days later, a large color flyer appeared on the Oak Meadows Community Bulletin Board, the one beside their polished clubhouse, where residents walked their designer dogs each evening. Harper drove past on her way to town and snapped a photo with her phone. The image showed our shelter grid. From a low, unflattering angle, shadows, exaggerated colors, desaturated rust spots zoomed in until the whole thing looked like a post-apocalyptic junkyard. Beneath it, in bold red caps, "This is not the Oak Meadows we want. Stop the industrial takeover." Smaller text urged residents to contact your HOA board to protect our shared standards. Jonah stared at the photo over dinner chili steaming in his bowl. "They make it look like we built a prison, Dad." Luke snorted. "Half those people couldn't tell a calving pen from a car wash." I leaned back, feeling the pressure settle behind my eyes, the same pressure that used to build when a critical beam was off by a fraction and the whole structure hung in the balance. But this time, it wasn't steel that might fail, it was us. The following morning, a gray sedan circled our fence line twice before parking near the gate. A man in a windbreaker stepped out with a tablet, pacing slowly, taking notes, measuring sight lines. I walked out to meet him, boots crunching on frozen gravel. "Morning, can I help you?" He didn't look up right away. "Surveyor. Hired by Oak Meadows to document visibility impact." "Visibility impact," I repeated, tasting the absurdity. He shrugged. "I just measure." I let him finish. I already knew our boundaries better than any hired tape measure. I'd walked every corner post myself, pulled the original 1952 plats from the county recorder. Our land was separate, grandfathered, untouchable by their covenants. But facts, I was learning, weren't the currency they traded in. That weekend, we invited a handful of real neighbors, the ones who lived on actual ranches south of us, the ones who understood wind chill and calf loss. We gave hayrides to their kids, let them hand-feed the calves through the viewing platform, demonstrated the gray water system and the solar heaters. One older rancher from the county AG extension board walked the grid, slowly nodding. "This could rewrite how small operations survive up here," he said quietly. I felt a flicker of pride until I caught movement on the ridge. Sun glinted off lenses, Karen's house, binoculars, watching. Monday brought Sheriff Dan Mulligan. He rolled up in his tan county truck, no lights, no hurry. Dan was a good man, knew every family in the valley by first name, waved even when he was serving papers. I met him halfway down the lane. "Morning, Colt." "Morning, Dan. Let me guess, HOA." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Afraid so. Claim your structures are a fire hazard and violate visual standards." I almost laughed. "We installed fire retardant foam and suppression lines last month." I figured. He sighed. "Just have to log the visit." "Mind if I walk the perimeter?" We did. He took a few photos of the solar arrays, the heavy-duty bracing, more out of professional curiosity than obligation. Before climbing back into his truck, he paused. "Off the record, they're loud, Colt, and they've got friends in high places. Might want to stay ahead of the noise. I'm not breaking any laws." "I know," he said, "but sometimes it's not about laws." His words stayed with me long after his taillights disappeared. By midweek, our mailbox began to overflow with anonymous envelopes, grainy photoshopped images of cattle standing beside toxic waste barrels. Headlines screaming about plummeting property values and neighborhood decline. Harper stopped sorting the mail altogether. Luke wanted to fight back online. I told him no. "They want a reaction," I said. "We don't give them that. We give them something they can't argue with." Quietly, methodically, I started compiling evidence. Every engineering drawing, every insulation spec, every photograph of warm calves on sub-zero nights. I built a portfolio thick enough to stop a bullet stamped with my professional seal. Then I submitted a formal request to the county planning department for an official review. If Karen Delaney and her board wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But on ground, I chose facts, measurements, and the unyielding truth of what we had built. Because this wasn't just about our ranch anymore. It was about whether a family could still build something better on their own land without asking permission from people who only cared about the view. Karen Delaney didn't waste time. She never did. It started with the drone. Jonah saw it first, a small black shape hovering just above the northwest corner of our modular grid as the sun bled orange across the ridge. It buzzed like an angry wasp, dipping low over the solar panels, lingering above the feed storage units, then swinging toward the main farmhouse with its camera lens glinting. Luke bolted outside, clutching his slingshot fury flashing in his eyes, but I caught his arm. "Let it fly," I said quietly. "We've got nothing to hide." Harper stepped onto the porch beside me, wiping flour from her hands onto an old dish towel. She watched the machine circle once more before it darted back toward the east ridge. "We both know whose toy that is," she murmured. That same evening, Karen posted her masterpiece on the private Oak Meadows community forum. The title alone made my jaw clench. "This is what's spreading next door." The video was expertly edited, colors drained to grim grays, a low ominous soundtrack of strings and distant thunder slow-motion zooms on every patch of surface rust we hadn't yet repainted. Drone shots swooped dramatically over the grid, making our sturdy shelters look jagged and menacing. The captions rolled like accusations. Industrial blight encroaching on our homes. Potential threat to property values. Unverified chemical storage containers. Harper stared at the screen in the lamplight of our kitchen, her face pale but fierce. "Chemical storage. We keep hay and mineral blocks in there." "She's not after truth," I said. "She's after fear." And fear spread quickly. By morning, the forum thread had exploded. Residents who had never set foot on our land posted frantic comments about health risks, falling home prices, even wild speculation that the steel modules might attract criminal elements. One woman claimed the sight of them gave her anxiety attacks. I almost laughed at that last one until Jonah came home from school quieter than usual. He sat at the table doing homework, pencil motionless. Finally, he looked up. "Some kid said we live in a junkyard now. Is that true, Dad?" The question hit harder than any drone footage ever could. That night, I walked him through the grid under the floodlights. I showed him the thick insulation layers keeping newborn calves warm, the automated temperature sensors blinking soft green, the clean concrete floors with drainage that kept everything dry and healthy. I let him rest his hand on the warm steel wall of a calving pen, where a heifer and her day-old calf slept peacefully. He listened, nodding slowly. Then, voice small, "Why do they hate what we made?" "They don't hate it," I told him. "They're scared of anything that doesn't look like their own backyard. And fear can turn good people mean." He leaned against me for a moment, 12 years old, and trying to understand a world that suddenly felt hostile. The campaign grew bolder. Karen organized an emergency HOA board meeting and invited a retired building inspector from 2 counties away, a personal acquaintance who delivered a polished PowerPoint on the supposed dangers of shipping container structures, mold accumulation, ventilation, and failures, structural collapse in snow load. He never once mentioned our triple redundant ventilation, our load-bearing reinforcements tested to twice the local snow weight, or our fire suppression standards. The room applauded anyway. Within days, nearly identical complaint forms began flooding the county planning office templates, clearly written by the same hand, filled out by different neighbors. Words like eyesore, emotional distress, and psychological impact appeared again and again. A clerk I knew from years of permit filings called me personally. "She's trying to bury you in paper," she warned. 5-6 complaints a day, all photocopies of the same language. Meanwhile, the cold shoulders began. Harper came home from the grocery store with fewer words than usual. A woman she'd known since high school looked right through her in the produce aisle. Luke found his pickup keyed in the feed store parking lot, long, angry scratches down the driver's side. Jonah's teacher sent home a note asking if everything was okay at home, as though our ranch had become a troubled household. The isolation settled over us like an early winter fog. Then came the glossy pamphlets. Professionally designed, trifold high-resolution drone images on heavy stock. Every mailbox in Oak Meadows received one. The cover showed our ranch from the worst possible angle, shadows deep and threatening, with the screaming headline, "Would you want to live next to this?" Inside bullet points about declining property values, safety concerns, and community character erosion. The back page listed county officials' phone numbers and a QR code linking to an online petition. Remove the industrial cattle complex from our view. By the second day, it had 312 signatures, more than half from people who lived 10-20 miles away. Karen understood optics better than engineering. But while she built her public bonfire of outrage, I worked in silence. I added motion-activated cameras along the fence line. I printed thermal imaging photos showing steady internal warmth on nights when the outside thermometer plunged below zero. I logged every calf birth, every health check, every solar output reading. I compiled videos of the herd thriving inside the modules during storms that would have cost us dozens of animals in the old collapsed barn. And I kept filing quiet, methodical requests For official reviews stamped drawings, certified calculations. Because if they wanted to fight with feelings, I would answer with undeniable proof. Then came the thick envelope from a courier. Inside 6 pages of legal-sounding threats titled Notice of Community Harm. The HOA now claimed our lawful agricultural operation caused substantial and ongoing psychological damage to neighboring residents. Luke read that line aloud and barked a laugh. Psychological damage from cows chewing hay. Harper didn't laugh. She folded the papers with careful precision and set them on the counter like evidence. That night, she found me in the workshop staring at boundary maps on 3 screens. "We're not backing down," I said before she could speak. "I know." She rested her hand on my shoulder, warm and steady. "But you don't have to carry this alone." She was right. The next morning, I made calls not to lawyers yet, but to people who understood land and livestock. The county age extension agent, a rural development officer, an old contact on the planning commission. I requested site visits, data reviews, anything official. If Karen wanted to turn perception into policy, I would force reality into the room. And I would make sure it spoke louder than fear ever could. The frost arrived early that year, whispering across the grass like a warning no one heeded. It began with thin crystals glittering on fence posts at dawn, then thickened into a hard crust that cracked beneath boot heels. The mornings grew heavier, quieter, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. We had enough feed stored for weeks, the herd was healthy, and the modular shelters stood firm. I should have felt secure. Instead, I felt the cold coming from somewhere else entirely. October 18th. A flatbed from Billings was due with a full load of premium alfalfa hay I'd negotiated for months earlier, critical for the coming deep freeze. The truck never arrived. When I called the driver, his voice was low, uneasy. They wouldn't let me through, Colt. Orange cones and signs blocking the south access road. A couple of folks in neon vests said it was closed for community beautification. Told me if I tried the back way, they'd have the sheriff on me. I gripped the phone until my knuckles went white. "That's a public right-of-way. I got kids to feed too," he muttered. I turned around. I drove the lane myself. Sure enough, a neat row of construction cones, 2 pickup trucks, and a fresh sign reading, "Community Maintenance, no through traffic." One of the men leaning against a tailgate was Trent Vickers, HOA board member, local real estate agent, and Karen's most loyal echo. He offered a thin smile when I stepped out of my truck. "Morning, Colt. Just some drainage work and mulching. Can't have heavy rigs tearing up the gravel." "You don't have a permit for this," I said. "I already checked with the county." He lifted his shoulders in an exaggerated shrug. "Administrative oversight. It'll be cleared up soon." I took photos of everything, cone signs, license plates, and filed complaints with the sheriff's office and county road enforcement the same hour. But paperwork moves slowly, and winter does not. That evening, Harper and I recounted bales in the storage units. We could stretch 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we rationed carefully. But pregnant cows and young calves needed calories when the mercury plunged. One hard cold snap could cost us dearly. And Karen knew it. The next morning, I found the sabotage. The main water line feeding the northwest row of modules had been cut clean. A length of PVC lay shattered in the frost, the end cap twisted off and flung into the sagebrush like trash. Water had sprayed across the ground overnight, freezing into a sheet of treacherous ice. Harper's sharp intake of breath behind me said everything. Luke cursed under his breath and stalked off toward the barn. Jonah stood silent, eyes wide. "We need cameras everywhere," Jonah said finally, voice small but steady. "We need more than that," Harper answered. I didn't sleep. I sat in the workshop instead, scrolling through county emails under the glow of a single lamp. One subject line glowed like a lifeline. Remodular Shelter Project. Site inspection approved, November 3rd. Less than 2 weeks away. I rallied the family at dawn. We scrubbed walkways until they gleamed, groomed every animal, touched up every visible surface with fresh gray primer. I ran full system diagnostics on the solar heaters and printed thermal scans showing steady internal warmth, even as outside temperatures dipped into the teens. We weren't just preparing for inspectors. We were preparing to prove beyond any doubt that what we had built was not merely legal, it was exceptional. But the attacks kept coming. A baseless noise complaint landed from the sheriff's office claiming industrial grinding and banging after dark. We'd shut the workshop down at 5 sharp every evening for months. Still, an official warning letter arrived. Then our roadside mailbox was smashed flat, the post snapped like kindling. A stack of glossy HOA Community Unity Week flyers lay nearby, one scrawled in black marker. Time to leave. Harper found them. She didn't cry. She simply gathered the pieces, carried them inside, and set them on the counter without a word. Later, I saw her at the sink scrubbing an already clean window until her reflection blurred. I wrapped my arms around her from behind. "We're not going anywhere," I whispered against her hair. She leaned back into me just enough to let me feel the tremor she refused to show the world. The nights grew sharper. Temperatures fell below 20, then 15. Frost turned to rime ice on the steel walls. But inside the modules, the herd slept in steady warmth. The insulation held like a promise. The solar circulation pumps hummed quietly. Not one calf lost. Yet outside our fence, the pressure never eased. Halloween night. Jonah's bedroom window exploded with a sharp crack. Red paintball splatter bloomed across the glass like blood. We all thought gunshot for a split second. I grabbed the rifle and swept the tree line with a spotlight, nothing but shadows and wind. Harper called the sheriff, while I checked the north pasture. Fresh tire tracks cut through frozen grass, deep enough to suggest deliberate wait. Dan Mulligan arrived within the hour, took statements, photographed everything. "Do they ever stop?" Harper asked him quietly. He shook his head. "Not until someone makes them." The worst came on November 1st, during the second brutal frost wave. Luke burst into the house near 11 p.m. Breath fogging in the kitchen light. "Southeast shelter. Something's wrong." I was out the door before he finished Boots' half-laced flashlight beam cutting the dark. 2 newborn calves stood outside their pen, shivering violently in the wind. The insulated access flap had been ripped from its hinges. The solar-powered gate hung twisted sideways, metal screeching as it swung. Harper and Jonah arrived seconds later. We worked in frantic silence, blankets, heat lamps, warm electrolyte drenches. Both calves survived, but it was close. I examined the damage under the floodlights, deep pry marks along the frame. A broken heavy-duty lock that would have taken serious tools and time. This wasn't vandalism anymore. This was an attempt to kill what we'd poured our lives into. I stood in the center of the grid that night, frost burning my lungs, and let out a roar into the empty dark, not fear, not surrender, but pure, blazing fury. They weren't trying to win a zoning argument. They were trying to break us. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, because the cold had taught us long ago how to endure, and we had only just begun to fight back. The cold deepened its grip on the valley, turning every breath into a visible cloud, and every footstep into a sharp crunch on frozen ground. But inside our home, a different kind of warmth began to build purpose. I turned the old feed storage container near the barn into a temporary office, heated floors from the grid, triple-glazed windows scavenged from a demolition site, and a wide drafting table lit by LED strips. Harper kept coffee coming in steel thermoses. The boys rotated chores with military precision, giving me the hours I needed. Night after night, I worked compiling what would become our unbreakable defense. 6 thick binders took shape on the table. 1. Full structural engineering drawings with load calculations. 2. Thermal performance logs and infrared photos. 3. Fire safety certifications and suppression system schematics. 4. Livestock health and welfare records, weight gain, 0 mortality through the cold snaps. 5. Water recycling and runoff data proving 0 environmental impact. 6. Time-stamped construction photos and videos from start to finish. Every page was tabbed, indexed, and stamped with my professional engineer seal. I wasn't just preparing for a site visit. I was preparing to rewrite the conversation. November 3rd circled on the calendar in red. We spent the final days making the ranch look like the proud operation it was. Luke pressure-washed every walkway until the concrete gleamed. Jonah groomed the calves until their black coats shone like oil in the weak sun. Harper baked bread and set out thermoses of chili for the visitors. We even strung temporary guide ropes along the tour path the way museums do for school groups. At 8:55 a.m. on the appointed morning, 3 vehicles rolled up the gravel drive under a sky the color of polished steel. First, the white truck with the County Office of Sustainable Development seal. Second, a dark SUV bearing the Montana Department of Agriculture emblem. Third, an unmarked gray pickup that made my heart skip until the driver stepped out. Marcus Linwood. I hadn't seen him since a modular housing project in Colorado Springs years earlier. He'd been the inspector who fought to save my license when a subcontractor cut corners. Now he worked as a state-level consultant on rural innovation. Colt Ramsey, he said, grinning as he extended a gloved hand. Figured you might need a friendly second opinion. The inspection team totaled 7 structural engineers, a code compliance officer, an environmental specialist, Ms. Rivera, from the AG department, Marcus, and a quiet land use attorney taking notes. Harper greeted them on the porch with steaming coffee and a smile that hid every sleepless night we'd endured. I started the tour exactly where I wanted at Unit 1, the control hub. Solar inverter bank here, I said, swinging open the heavy insulated door. Redundant temperature sensors wired to every module. Backup diesel generator buried under Unit 16 with automatic failover. They followed in a loose semicircle, boots crunching, breath-fogging notebooks already filling. We moved methodically down the rows. Feed storage with passive cooling vents. Gray water filtration and recycling loop. Heated calving pens with soft rubber flooring and infrared lamps. Roof runoff collection feeding stock tanks. Heavy-duty anchoring plates designed for 120 bachelor wind loads. I handed out laminated site maps and code reference sheets as we walked. I answered every question before it was fully asked. I recited wind load calculations the way other men recite baseball stats. I knew every weld, every bolt, every gauge of steel. By the time we reached the viewing platform overlooking the entire grid, even the most skeptical faces had softened. Marcus turned to the group. This is the most thoroughly executed container-based livestock system I've seen anywhere in the Mountain West. Ms. Rivera nodded. Internal temperatures held steady at 55 degrees during last week's -12 nights. That's better than many conventional barns. Quiet murmurs of agreement rippled through the team. We were circling back toward the farmhouse when the interruption arrived. A bright red SUV skidded to a stop on the gravel, kicking up frozen dust. Karen Delaney stepped out in a crimson blazer and heels that sank slightly with every furious step. She clutched a glossy red folder like a shield. "Excuse me," she announced, loudly, planting herself between me and the inspectors. "I am here to file a formal community impact statement." One of the county engineers lifted an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is a scheduled state and county site evaluation." I'm fully aware she cut in chin high, which is precisely why the residents' concerns must be heard. This facility is causing measurable stress, health anxiety, and documented decline in neighboring property values. She thrust the folder toward Marcus. He opened it, flipped through a few pages, then looked up with calm curiosity. Screenshots of social media comments, an online poll with 312 votes, and one drone photograph taken from public airspace. "Those documents illustrate real community harm," Karen insisted. "No," Marcus replied evenly. "They illustrate opinion. We evaluate measurable risk, code compliance, and engineering standards." A faint flush crept up Karen's neck. "You'll come to regret dismissing the human element." She spun on her heel blazer, flapping like a battle flag, and marched back to her vehicle. The engine roared as she sped away, gravel pinging against our fence posts. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Marcus closed the folder and handed it back to the attorney without a word. Then he turned to me. "You have the master documentation ready." I passed him the final binder, my original tabbed and annotated. He leafed through it slowly, nodding as he read. Finally, he looked at the team. "Let's conclude the report," he said. "This facility doesn't just comply, it exceeds." I stood by the gate long after their taillights vanished down the ridge, letting the cold bite my face until the feeling returned. That night, we gathered around the kitchen table, fire crackling in the wood stove, venison stew simmering, the boys' laughter, finally free of the weight we'd all carried for weeks. Harper reached across and took my hand. "You didn't shout," she said softly. "You didn't sink to their level. You just built something they couldn't tear down." I looked at my calloused palms, then at the faces I loved most in the world. "And now," I said, "they're going to have to live with it." Outside, the steel modules stood silent, under the stars, warm, unyielding, and finally undeniably right. The tide had turned. But I knew Karen Delaney well enough to understand one thing. She wouldn't accept defeat quietly. She would come back swinging. And when she did, we would be ready. The relief lasted exactly 3 days. November 6th dawned still and bitter, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears before a storm. I was on the porch with my first cup of coffee watching the sky shift from charcoal to pale steel when the pounding started, frantic fists hammering the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Luke got there first, yanking it open. Benji, the lanky teenager from the ranch south of us, stood gasping on the threshold, coat half-zipped, face flushed from running. "They're in your east pasture," he panted, "tearing things apart right now." The words hit like a slap. I was moving before my mug hit the floor, boots barely on coat grabbed mid-stride. Luke vaulted into the passenger seat. Jonah shouted he'd bring the drone. Harper stayed behind to call the sheriff, her voice steady even as her eyes betrayed everything. The east pasture lay farthest from the house, up a gentle rise that marked the invisible boundary with oak meadows. We'd planned to expand the grid there next spring. 3 critical units already sat on that ground: backup feed, storage, the veterinary supply module, and the main thermal regulator that fed warmth to half the shelters. I crested the ridge and slammed the brakes so hard the truck fishtailed on frost-slick gravel. They were there, 5 figures in the pale morning light. Karen Delaney in her red blazer, barking orders. Trent Vickers, waving a piece of paper like a warrant. 2 men in reflective vests I didn't recognize. And a burly contractor with a tool belt already prying at the regulator unit's anchor bolts. Cables lay exposed like severed arteries. One vent panel hung crooked crowbar marks bright against the steel. They didn't notice us until my boots hit the ground. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My voice carried across the frozen air, low and lethal. Karen whirled, surprise flickering before the mask snapped back into place. "This is a community enforcement action. These structures are unsafe and in visual violation. This is my land," I cut in stepping closer. "You're trespassing. That's criminal vandalism." Trent thrust his paper forward. "We posted an emergency compliance notice. Section 14 allows preemptive." "There is no Section 14 that lets you cross my fence with bolt cutters," I said. "Step away from my equipment. Now." Luke was already in the truck bed, powering up the drone. It lifted with a sharp whine, camera rolling. Karen's eyes tracked it, color draining from her face. The hired man glanced nervously at her. "You said this was authorized, lady." Karen hesitated just long enough. Harper's voice crackled over the radio on my belt. "Sheriff Dan is en route. 5 minutes." Karen's composure cracked. She gestured sharply to the others. "We'll finish this in court." They retreated toward their vehicles, boots crunching, leaving tools scattered like evidence. Karen paused as she passed me, voice a venomous hiss. "This isn't over." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The drone had captured everything in high definition, Karen directing the crew, the contractor wrenching at the regulator, Trent pacing my property line with his useless paper. Sheriff Dan arrived minutes later, lights off, but expression grim. He surveyed the damage, listened to Benji's shaken account, watched the drone footage on my tablet without comment. Then he called it in trespass vandalism, possible conspiracy to interfere with agricultural operations. Harper pulled up with Jonah as deputies began photographing the scene. She hugged Jonah tight when she saw the torn open unit. Luke stood beside me, fists clenched but breathing slow. "Charges?" Harper asked Dan quietly. "We've got enough to open a case," he said, "and this time it sticks." But the real shift came the next morning. The local paper hit driveways with a front-page headline that stopped traffic. HOA members caught allegedly vandalizing sustainable cattle farm in winter cold. Drone stills filled half the page. A sidebar quoted Marcus Linwood, calling our system a benchmark for cold climate livestock housing. My phone started buzzing before sunrise. Neighbors, old friends, even reporters. By evening, the story had jumped online. Agriculture forums dissected our design. A national rural life magazine picked it up. Then, a 30-second clip of Karen storming away from the pasture, drone overhead, face flushed with fury, went viral under the hashtag #CattleKaren. I never asked for the spotlight, but I wasn't about to waste it. A week later, the county zoning office released an official statement. The Ramsey Modular Livestock Housing System is in full compliance with all applicable structural, environmental, and land use codes. Furthermore, the county will review the scope and authority of HOA enforcement actions beyond deeded boundaries. Karen fought back hard, hired a lawyer, threatened the newspaper with libel, even sat for a tearful local TV interview, claiming she feared for resident safety. It didn't land. Luke came home from school grinning for the first time in months, classmates slapping his back, teachers asking questions about the solar grid. Jonah's science teacher requested a class tour. Harper caught herself humming while cooking. We had held the line. We had not broken. And for the first time, since the first container touched our soil, the future felt wider than the ridge that had once boxed us in. But the county wasn't finished. They were just getting started. The county didn't come with fanfare. They came with purpose. November 10th brought a small convoy of marked trucks easing up our gravel drive while light snow swirled in lazy spirals. No sirens, no media, just quiet professionals in windbreakers and steel-toed boots, clipboards in hand, measuring tapes at the ready. This time, the review wasn't only about our steel modules. It was about the Oak Meadows HOA itself. Marcus Linwood was there again, along with Ms. Rivera, a county ethics investigator named Kellen, and a land use attorney whose calm eyes missed nothing. They walked the perimeter, slowly photographing boundary markers, noting sight lines, and asking careful questions about every incident we'd endured. Harper served hot coffee on the porch, while the boys watched from the barn doorway, wide-eyed and hopeful. Marcus paused beside me near the east pasture fence, the same ground still scarred from the vandalism. "This has gone beyond containers, Colt," he said quietly. "It's about how far an HOA can reach when it decides someone doesn't belong." I nodded, throat tight. He added Karen poked a bear she never bothered to understand. The vandalism footage combined with the viral coverage had lit a fuse. 2 Oak Meadows homeowners had come forward anonymously with sworn statements. Karen had pressured them into filing complaints by threatening to target their own minor landscaping issues if they refused. Within days, the county froze all pending HOA enforcement actions in the area and launched a formal investigation into board conduct. Karen responded the only way she knew how, louder. A mass email went out to every Oak Meadows resident accusing me of orchestrating a vindictive media smear. She claimed our family harbored militia tendencies because we lived off-grid and kept a generator. She even suggested the solar panels were part of some shadowy prepper network. The more she swung, the more desperate she sounded. November 13th brought the public hearing at the County Planning Commission, officially about routine zoning updates, but every seat in the room knew the truth. We arrived early and took seats in the third row. Harper's hand rested steady in mine. Luke and Jonah flanked us, dressed in their best flannel. I carried no briefcase, just the quiet certainty of a man who had done nothing wrong. Karen swept in 15 minutes late, flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. Her smile looked painted on brittle at the edges. When Marcus took the microphone, the room stilled. In 10 years of reviewing rural projects, he said, "I have rarely seen one that marries innovation, sustainability, and regulatory compliance as cleanly as the Ramsey system. It is not merely legal, it is exemplary." Ms. Rivera followed. "These modular shelters maintain internal temperatures superior to many traditional barns in USDA Hardiness Zone 4. They reduce carbon emissions by nearly 50% through solar integration. There is zero runoff, zero health violations, and documented improvement in livestock welfare." Karen's lead attorney tried to interrupt. "We're here to discuss community harm, not efficiency metrics." Marcus turned to him unflinching. "The only documented harm originated from trespass vandalism and coordinated harassment directed at the Ramsey family, none of which came from their property." A ripple of murmurs spread. Heads turned. A few residents from Oak Meadows shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The commission chairman cleared his throat. "The county finds the Ramsey operation in full compliance. We are additionally reviewing whether certain HOA actions constitute regulatory overreach beyond deeded jurisdiction." Karen whispered urgently to her lawyers, cheeks flaming. Then the chairman delivered the line that landed like a hammer. "Effective immediately, the Montana Agricultural Innovation Office recognizes Ramsey Resilience Ranch as an official pilot site for modular cold-weather livestock housing." Harper's fingers tightened around mine until they hurt. Quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. Luke's hand landed heavy on my shoulder. Jonah stared straight ahead, eyes shining with something brighter than vindication. When we stepped outside afterward, a reporter from the Montana Morning Ledger intercepted us on the sidewalk. "Mr. Ramsey, did you ever imagine a cattle shelter built from shipping containers would set legal precedent?" I managed a small, tired smile. No, ma'am. I just wanted my animals warm and my family safe. The headline the next morning read, Containers versus Covenants, One Family's Stand Reshapes Rural Zoning Debate. And suddenly we weren't the problem anymore. We were the example. The investigation accelerated. Leaked emails surfaced Karen coordinating with Trent to pressure feed suppliers, hay haulers, even the local vet to delay or deny service. One message ended with the chilling line, We'll make daily life so uncomfortable, they'll leave on their own. It backfired spectacularly. By Thanksgiving, Karen had been suspended from the HOA board, pending ethics review. A recall election was scheduled for early December. Meanwhile, our ranch became something new. We hosted an open Thanksgiving tour. Over 40 people came, ranchers from 3 counties, curious locals, county officials, even a few sheepish Oak Meadows residents. Jonah proudly demonstrated the thermal circulation pumps. Luke organized a calf-petting corral that had kids laughing in the snow. Harper served spiced cider beneath the solar array, while steam rose from crock pots of chili. I stood in the middle of it all, watching strangers walk our paths, with respect instead of judgment, and felt something loosen in my chest I hadn't realized was knotted. The county had not merely defended us, they had chosen us. And in doing so, they had drawn a line in the frost that no amount of fear or entitlement could erase. But the final reckoning was still coming, and it would happen in a packed town hall under bright lights where Karen Delaney would finally face the community she claimed to protect. December 3rd, the town hall meeting that everyone in the valley had been waiting for. The agenda claimed it was about infrastructure updates and budget proposals, but the parking lot was full an hour early. Pickup trucks lined up beside polished SUVs. Breath fog hanging in the frigid air like unspoken words. Cameras from 2 local stations idled near the entrance. Sheriff Dan Mulligan stood discreetly by the side door, arms folded, watching the crowd file in. We arrived early on purpose, not for drama, but for seats. Harper wore her good wool coat, the one with the deep collar that framed her face like quiet armor. Luke and Jonah matched in clean flannel shirts tucked in for once. I carried only a thin binder under my arm closure, not ammunition. The hall filled to standing room only. Extra folding chairs had been hastily added along the back wall. Oak Meadows board members sat stiffly at the long front table, beneath fluorescent lights' name placards gleaming. Karen Delaney occupied the second seat from the left, red blazer bright as a warning flag posture, rigid lips pressed thin. She glanced our way once as we settled in the third row. Her eyes flicked past us like we were furniture. The moderator county liaison, Greta Holmes, opened with measured calm. We'll begin with a brief update from the Oak Meadows HOA on recent enforcement activities and community outreach, followed by public comment. Karen leaned into her microphone before Greta had fully lowered her hand. Thank you, she began, voice polished and rehearsed. For years, the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association has worked tirelessly to preserve the aesthetic integrity, property values, and shared harmony of our neighborhood. In light of recent distortions in the media, I want to refocus this conversation on community standards' long-term vision and the responsibility we all share to maintain the character that makes our homes desirable. She pulled a fresh red folder from her briefcase, another one, and opened it with deliberate care. Contrary to inflammatory narratives, our board's actions were always intended to protect residents from unpermitted industrial encroachment that threatened. A voice from the third row cut through like a blade. Is that why you had my son-in-law climb a livestock fence with bolt cutters? The room rippled. Karen blinked. A gray-haired woman stood, hands trembling but voice steady. You called it preserving community standards. I call it felony trespass. Murmurs swelled into open talk. Karen gripped the table edge. I will not be interrupted or harassed during my allotted. You harassed an entire family. A man in a Carhartt jacket called from the back. You spent my HOA dues like ammunition. Karen tried to pivot. Let us be perfectly clear, Mr. Ramsey's installation of rusting shipping containers was unsightly, violated the spirit of our covenants. The law doesn't care about your spirit, someone shouted. Greta raised both hands. Order. We will move to the formal complaint summary. County Investigator James Kellen took the microphone. Calm, methodical, he clicked the projector remote. 3 oversized images filled the screen. 1. A screenshot of Karen's email. We need to squeeze the cattleman until he folds. 2. A complaint form signed by Trent Vickers, time-stamped 2 days after the sheriff had warned them to stand down. A frozen drone frame Karen mid-gesture directing the contractor as he pried at our thermal regulator. Kellen's voice carried easily over the sudden hush. We have clear evidence of coordinated efforts to harass, obstruct, and damage lawful agricultural operations outside the HOA's legal jurisdiction. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, no words came. Greta turned to her. Ms. Delaney, would you like to respond? Karen rose slowly, as though her legs weren't entirely convinced. She scanned the packed room, searching for allies, finding none. For years, she said, voice cracking at the edges, I have served this community. Voluntarily, tirelessly. I've fought unsightly paint colors, unapproved fences, satellite dishes that ruined rooflines. I kept us beautiful. I kept us valuable. A low, disbelieving laugh rolled through the seats. You laugh, she snapped, composure fracturing. Do you want to live next to a metal junkyard, rusting boxes stacked like some third-world shanty town, to become the neighborhood people slow down to gawk at on their way to town? They're cleaner than your conscience, a voice muttered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. Karen's eyes blazed. I did what none of you had the courage to do. I protected you. Greta stood. That is enough. No, it isn't. Karen's shout echoed off the cinderblock walls. He built an ugly fortress, and you all applauded him. I followed the rules. You broke the law. The words came from the back row, quiet, certain. Mine. Every head turned. Karen froze, staring at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time. I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. You crossed my fence line, I said. You damaged equipment my family built with our own hands. You lied about us to suppliers, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen. And when you were caught on camera, you didn't apologize. You doubled down. The room held its breath. Karen's mouth trembled. For the first time since this began, the polished mask slipped completely, revealing something raw: anger, fear, disbelief that the world had turned against her. The HOA board chairman rose beside her. Given the findings presented, he said, voice flat, the board has voted to remove Ms. Delaney from her position, effective immediately. The words landed like a judge's gavel. Karen exhaled sharply, half gasp, half protest. No one moved to support her. Trent stared at the table in front of him, as though it might open and swallow him whole. She gathered her red folder with shaking hands, turned and walked down the center aisle. Heels clicked too loudly in the silence. As she passed our row, her eyes met mine for a final second. There was no defiance left, only the stunned emptiness of someone who had never imagined losing. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud. The next morning, her resignation letter was emailed to every Oak Meadows resident. 3 weeks later, a quiet for sale sign appeared in her front yard. She left town before the snow melted. But the fear she had tried to plant, the idea that different was dangerous, that innovation threatened harmony, never took root. Because the truth had finally spoken louder. And in the bright, unforgiving light of that town hall, the community she claimed to protect had chosen something stronger than her version of perfect. They chose resilience. Winter tightened its hold as December deepened, snow piling in soft drifts against the steel walls and glazing the fence lines with ice that caught the low sun like scattered diamonds. But something extraordinary began to happen amid the cold. People arrived not with complaints or clipboards, but with curiosity and respect. It started with a single letter on official stationery from the Montana Department of Agriculture, inviting me to speak at their annual Rural Innovation Summit. The topic: cold climate livestock housing lessons from the front lines. I read it twice at the kitchen table, half expecting it to vanish like a dream. Harper leaned over my shoulder, her hand warm on my neck. You've earned this, she said simply. The world's finally catching up. But the invitations kept coming. A professor from Montana State University requested a guided tour for her sustainable agriculture class. A USDA Rural Development Field Officer emailed for detailed blueprints and performance data. A public broadcasting documentary crew proposed profiling what they called the container ranch that redefined resilience. I never sought the attention. Truth be told, part of me still braced for the next fight. But I recognized opportunity when it knocked. I accepted the summit speech, drove 3 hours through a blinding snowstorm in January blazer pressed for the first time in years, and stood before a crowded hall of ranchers, engineers, extension agents, and policymakers. I showed slides of our thermal airflow maps, solar yield curves, and calf survival rates, up 35% since the modules went online. Then I told them about Karen. Not to settle scores, but to illustrate the real-world friction when innovation meets entrenched expectation. Afterward, 3 older ranchers waited at the podium to shake my hand. "We're putting in a smaller version near Billings," one said. "County just greenlit container ag structures cited your precedent." Another younger asked for advice on navigating his own HOA skirmish. I gave him Marcus Linwood's contact and told him to document everything. Driving home through dark passes, snow hissing against the windshield, I felt the shift settle deep in my bones. What we had built was no longer just ours. It was spreading. Back home, the county wrapped its investigation with a report that scorched the page: systematic overreach, abuse of authority, coordinated suppression of lawful land use. 3 Oak Meadows board members resigned quietly before the recall vote could humiliate them further. Then the state took notice. The Montana Zoning Review Committee convened a special session. 2 weeks later, they released draft legislation, the Property Jurisdiction Clarity Act, explicitly limiting HOA enforcement to deeded boundaries only. Our case was cited repeatedly as the catalyst. Versions of the policy began appearing in neighboring states. Planning offices started referencing the Ramsey model when approving alternative livestock housing. Harper read the headlines aloud over breakfast, eyes dancing. Ramsey Ranch makes state news again, this time page 3. Luke pulled up a livestock innovation blog on his phone. "They're calling us the Tesla of cattle farms, Dad." Jonah deadpan as ever asked if that meant we could order robotic cows. I laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like years. But the moment that truly floored me arrived in late January. An email from the USDA Office of Rural Innovation. After reviewing our documentation site reports and policy impact, they wish to award Ramsey Resilience Ranch a multi-year federal research grant. The goals scale our modular system as a replicable solution for small and mid-size operations in cold climates, especially in economically stressed rural areas. They offered technical partnerships, university interns, patent assistance, even funding for demonstration builds on other ranches. I read it 3 times before showing Harper. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. "This isn't just recognition," she whispered. "This is legacy." We walked the grid that evening under floodlight snow crunching beneath our boots. Warm vapor plumed gently from the vents. Inside the herd moved in quiet rhythm. Healthy content alive because of what we had refused to abandon. Harper slipped her gloved hand into mine. "Your fortress held," she said. I shook my head. "Our fortress." She smiled up at the stars. "Think Karen ever looks up property listings in warmer states and wonders what went wrong? Probably still searching for a neighborhood with a covenant against steel," I replied. We laughed together, the sound carrying across the snow and echoing off the modules like a promise kept. Because we hadn't merely survived a campaign of fear. We had turned it into something that could warm barns, save herds, and steady livelihoods for families we would never meet. One determined weld at a time. And as spring began to whisper at the edges of winter meltwater trickling in the ditches, the first brave crocuses pushing through frost, something else took root on our land. Hope. Real, measurable, built to last hope. The kind that no covenant, no complaint, no cold night could ever dismantle. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the land itself wanted to savor the thaw. By late March, stubborn patches of ice still lingered in the shadows between the steel modules, and the soil along the fence lines remained iron-hard in places. But we didn't mind the wait. After the winter we had endured the battles fought in frost and floodlights, the gradual melt felt like a quiet celebration. Life returned in its own unhurried rhythm. The herd, calved, strong, and early black newborns stumbling across fresh green shoots under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Luke designed and welded a custom ear tag station from scrap steel and reclaimed barnwood, dubbing it Unit 101, with a grin that hadn't left his face in months. Jonah spent evenings reprogramming the solar monitoring system to ping alerts directly to his phone, declaring himself Chief Sustainability Officer, while Harper ruffled his hair and pretended to salute. For the first time since we'd driven that overloaded trailer back to Harper's childhood home, our ranch felt truly at peace. The low hum of tension that had lived in our walls, the watchful glances toward the ridge, the flinch at every unexpected vehicle on the lane was gone. Oak Meadows had gone quiet too. Karen's house stood empty for weeks, windows dark until an understated for sale sign appeared one April morning. It sold quickly below asking price to a young couple elementary school teachers with a minivan full of moving boxes and bright plastic lawn chairs. On their second day, they walked over with a plate of cookies, introduced themselves as the Millers, and shyly asked if their third graders could tour the famous container ranch for a sustainability unit. Harper said yes before they finished the question. Jonah volunteered to lead the first group. There were no more anonymous flyers, no smashed mailboxes, no drone shadows at dusk. Just the ordinary sounds of a ranch waking up lowing cattle, the distant clang of Luke tightening a gate that didn't need tightening but deserved perfection, and the soft rush of meltwater in the ditches. Then came the morning we raised the sign. It was Harper's idea from the beginning, though she insisted it be a family project. We planed and sanded a thick plank of old oak salvaged from her grandfather's original barn, hand-burned the letters deep with a torch until they stood proud and blackened, then sealed it with layers of clear varnish until it gleamed like polished stone. On a bright Saturday in early May, with wildflowers pushing up along the drive, and the air smelling of warm pine, we dug the post holes at the front gate. Neighbors drifted over, some from the South Road, a few from Oak Meadows itself. One brought a rhubarb pie still warm from the oven. Another, a woman who had once signed Karen's petition, offered homemade lavender soap and a quiet apology. We didn't really know she said eyes on the ground. We just listened. I nodded. Now you've seen it. And they had. Hundreds had. The PBS documentary, Steel Against the Storm, aired nationwide that month. 52 minutes of quiet power, sweeping drone shots of snow-draped modules glowing warm against the night close-ups of calves nuzzling infrared lamps, interviews with Marcus and Ms. Rivera, and slow pans across our family, laughing together in the calving pens. The narrator's voice lingered over the final town hall footage of Karen walking out alone. What happens when petty power meets unyielding purpose? What happens when one family refuses to trade resilience for approval? The closing shot held on Harper and me standing beneath the new sign, wind lifting her scarf, the mountains rising timeless behind us. I didn't watch the broadcast. I took a walk instead through the grid past the viewing platform, where school kids now waved from yellow buses across the small bridge Luke had fabricated from old panels. I ended up on the southern ridge, where the pasture met the tree line, the exact spot where Karen's binoculars once glinted. The sun warmed my face. Everything lay open and clear. I thought about every weld we'd laid under pressure, every threat we'd swallowed, every boundary we'd refused to yield. Not out of stubbornness, out of belief. That evening, Harper joined me on the porch with a thin folder of printed letters, messages from ranchers in Wyoming, North Dakota, even Canada. Architects sketching their own versions. Students citing our story in policy papers. One letter from a veteran starting a small herd in Idaho simply read, "You proved we don't have to ask permission to build something that works. Thank you." Harper leaned against my shoulder. We did more than survive cold. I looked out at the modules, catching the last light warm vapor still rising gently into the cooling air. "We changed the weather," I said. She laughed softly, the deep, unguarded laugh I'd fallen in love with years ago. That spring, we launched Farm Forward, a hands-on program for young farmers, veterans, and students eager to learn off-grid systems. Jonah gave enthusiastic tours of the solar loop. Luke built portable demonstration units that folded flat for transport. Harper started a blog that quickly gathered thousands of followers hungry for practical hope. And I kept building, because that's who I am. Not a warrior, a builder. One who now knows beyond any doubt that a good idea backed by hard work, clear truth, and a family that refuses to break can outlast fear, entitlement, and even the harshest winter. You can't bulldoze resilience with complaints. You can't bury innovation under red tape. And you can't stop people who have already decided what kind of world they intend to leave behind. We hung that oak sign together, posts set deep in Montana soil. Ramsey Resilience Ranch. Established in truth, built in steel. It stands there still, catching sunrise and storm alike. A quiet reminder that sometimes the strongest thing you can build isn't made of steel at all. It's made of the refusal to yield what matters most. One container, one choice, one unbreakable day at a time.